Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's really important session on sustainability and the role of the board. I hope you're all keeping well. We have lots of people who have registered for this webinar today, so we're really looking forward to hearing your contributions later on. If you have some questions and answers, we really would like you to submit your questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen in Zoom. Please don't use the messaging button, as we will not be monitoring this for the webinar. We also have the opportunity for you to join and follow the webinar on Twitter, or indeed plan to post. Please use the hashtag ESG and the board. As I mentioned at the outset, sustainability and the role of the board is a topic I think that has gathered huge traction. We're really pleased on behalf of the Institute of Directors to be partnering with Business in the Community in Ireland and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development on this hugely important topic. It's interesting that back in January, when the IOD did some director sentiment with our own members, that at that point in time, 85% of our members agreed with the statement that the issue of sustainability should be a regular standing item on a board's agenda. So it's clear that we've moved from sustainability being a nice to have rather than being something that's nice to have, that it's something that's really important for boards and directors to focus on. The topics today will cover the roles of ESG particularly, and we have joined by a fantastic panel of speakers who I know will have enormous both experience and insights to share. So without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to Tomas Srkovic, CEO of Business in the Community in Ireland. Thank you.
And good morning, everybody. I would like to first and foremost echo the sentiment on behalf of Business in the Community of how delighted we are to be partnering with the IOD this morning on this very important session. So delighted to see so many of you this morning. We're very impressed by the response, not only to see C-suite, CEOs, senior management, sustainability practitioners, but of course, board directors interested and attending this session today. So you're all very, very welcome. Just in terms of some quick housekeeping, Maura has gone through it all. The only thing I would like to add is that the session will be recorded, just so you know, as we can share it further with other colleagues and directors who are interested in the session. And I would strongly encourage the use of that Q&A box, because we want to hear from you and see how you are seeing these issues developing in your organizations and in the boards in which you sit. For those of you who don't know Business in the Community, we are a movement for change in business for sustainability. We have been working for the last 20 years with 100 of Ireland's largest companies, and our agenda is very much geared towards ensuring that we can all promote an economy that is low carbon, resilient, sustainable, as well as a society that is inclusive and where everyone thrives. And we work collaboratively and individually with companies on being the advisor and the agent that raises awareness towards sustainability. And for the last 20 years, we have been talking about the importance of sustainability being present not only within the strategy of the organization, not only within the CEO office and the C-suite, but most importantly in the boardroom. And it's fantastic to hear Maura's reflection on the sentiment of directors at the IOD on the importance of sustainability. And I'm sure you will all agree the last few months have proven, if anything, that sustainability is a fundamental issue. So let's go straight into the agenda. And as Maura said, we have a really interesting, high-level packed agenda prepared for you this morning. I'm delighted, as Maura mentioned, that we are partnering with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development as well as IOD this morning. And first and foremost, we're going to hear from Mario Abella, Mario is a director at the Redefining Value team within the World Business Council, and he is an expert on some of the fundamental topics that we'll be discussing, and he will set the scene and will set the tone for what is coming and how director obligations and opportunities have evolved in this space. Immediately after that, I am truly delighted to have the opportunity of facilitating a conversation between Bea Araujo, partner at Baker & McKenzie, who is also an expert on boards and has a significant experience on advising large international organizations on corporate governance, and John Reynolds, who is the non-executive chairman of Kern PLC, to give us that direct experience and dimension of how a growing public company like Kern is looking into the world of ESG and sustainability. And as I said before, there'll be plenty of time for questions, so we would strongly encourage you. So let's go into it without further ado. So my next task is I have the pleasure of introducing Mario. So just let me read two notes from Mario's biography and then hand over to him. As I said, Mario is a director within the Redefining Value initiative at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Mario leads several projects with the membership on transforming performance management, governance, assurance, and internal control. Mario has held senior management positions in the private and public sector in Australia, Belgium, the UK, and the US, both in private and public sector, as I said. He advises the UN on corporate reporting and is a lecturer and a researcher on accounting, audit, and reporting. So I think you'll agree we couldn't have had a better expert this morning. And I have to say, Mario, I'm really grateful to you and the team at the World Business Council. It's a privilege for us to be the national partner of the World Business Council here in Ireland and to learn from some of your great expertise. So I'll hand over to you, Mario, and I'll come back to everybody in a few minutes. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Thomas, and for that very kind introduction. It's great to be here. It's very exciting for us to be able to engage with the director community in Ireland. We've been working on our governance project now for several years with Baker McKenzie and Deloitte as our key partners, and so really thrilled to be here today. So on to the next slide, please. Just to give you a quick overview in case you've not heard of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. I'm not sure we could have come up with a worse title for an organisation, and no one can ever remember the acronym because it has so many letters in it. But basically, notwithstanding the need for possibly a more succinct title, we're a membership organisation of 200 global companies that really are united around a common vision of creating a world in which 9 billion people are all living well within planetary boundaries by 2050. So that's quite a task that we're looking to achieve. On to the next slide, please. So just to give you a sense of our membership, you'll see a lot of familiar names, and these are all companies that are committed to sustainable development. They're on the journey. Some are obviously much more advanced than others, but the underlying aspect of our members is that they're all working towards building a more sustainable world. On to the next slide, please. I'm going to move through this fairly quickly. You can read more about WBCSD on our website. We're organised around 6 programs. Those programs are circular economy, so trying to limit the amount of waste on the planet, particularly addressing plastics as well. Being able to have cities that we can get around that are clean and connected, that we can thrive in. So addressing mobility is a key part to well-functioning cities. Climate and energy is all about achieving net zero, and I'm sure you've all heard about that. Food and nature is all about making sure we continue to feed everyone on the planet, but in doing so, maintain nature so that it continues to be there as a resource. People, making sure that people's basic human rights and basic needs are catered for, and then redefining value, which is the program I work within, is all about how do we have a more sustainable world where capital flows to those companies that are more sustainable. And when we use the term sustainable, it is very much in the context of a successful business. So it's all about sustainable in terms of having a business model that works and continues to work and adapt. Next slide, please. So I'm going to explain to you some of the context of our work on governance. And we call it modernizing governance, and you'll see why as I talk through what I think are the changes that are happening in the governance landscape. Next slide, please. So this is what we're dealing with. You may have seen this before. If you haven't, it's all based on science. It's called a donut simply because it looks like the shape of a donut. It was developed as a combination of work on the environment done by Rockstrom, who's a leading world scientist on the environment, and Kay Rayworth, an economist at Oxford University. And it's a fairly simple diagram. It says that we have an ecological ceiling, and this is again all based on science, that we can't exceed. Because if we exceed that ceiling, we don't know what happens next. And similarly, on the social side, there's a social foundation, a floor, if you like. And if we go below that floor, again, we don't really know what's going to happen. Now, as you can see, we are exceeding, we're going below the floor on a number of social fronts, and we're exceeding a lot of these environmental boundaries as well. And so the consequence of all of this is that we don't know what happens next. And that's the reality. And that's really the importance of showing this slide to you, is that this is the challenges you continue to face as directors on boards and those who support boards, in terms of we don't know what's going to happen next. This time last year, if you had mentioned that we would be doing this conference by webinar because there's a global pandemic, no one would have believed you. So that's the key point. Business as usual has gone. We can no longer expect tomorrow to be like today. The world is constantly changing, and therefore, if we're going to thrive, we're going to have businesses that thrive, we need to be able to manage this level of uncertainty and volatility, because we are in the red zone on a lot of these areas. I mean, it was terrifying. I was watching the news just a couple of days ago, and there were discussions, there was a presentation by the reporter on two armed militias in the US. These are very big groups of white supremacists and the Black Panther movement supporting the rights of Black people in America. And they have basically armed themselves with military rifles and machinery, basically to go to war at the end of the election, depending on what the outcome is. I mean, it's terrifying that we live in that sort of world today, whether we're talking developed countries or less developed countries. That is the reality that we're facing. On to the next slide, please. So the first governance revolution, and governance has been disputed, and what constitutes good governance has been disputed really since the corporate form of the company was established in law. People have been arguing about what is the purpose of the corporation, and the argument continues. So the first wave of corporate governance came with the formalization of governance codes with the Cadbury Code, which resulted in a corporate governance code in the 90s, again reacting to the excesses of Maxwell and others, and a lot of those disasters culminated in the need for there to be better governance of the corporation. Now, the quote comes, there's the fairly old looking text is because it's from almost 30 years ago, and it's a comment letter sent in by British companies to the Cadbury inquiry. And the thing to point out there is already there's this tension being raised about the role of the corporation. And what we saw in the first phase of corporate governance was very much around getting the sort of belts and braces right in terms of the code and ensuring that we have, you know, a number of outside directors, board independence, appropriate remuneration. So this was really getting the wiring of boards right. And that's pretty much established now around the world. That's been codified in corporate governance codes around the world, including the OECD's principles for corporate governance. Next slide, please. So I'd argue that we're now going through another revolution in corporate governance, where really it's not just about profitability. This quote from the British Academy: profitability, solving the problems of people and planet, and not profiting from creating problems for people and planet. It's as simple as that. And successful businesses really understand what that means. And why are we seeing this second revolution in governance? Well, it's one of the data points you could look at is that other stakeholders beyond shareholders are starting to make claims. They've been making claims for some time, but in areas like climate change, if you look at the amount of litigation, the number of cases is increasing rapidly, and it's not just a US phenomenon, it's happening all over the world. And this is proving to be very costly for companies. So it's really throwing the spotlight on the need to change the focus from the board really being preoccupied with its relationship with the shareholder to actually looking at its relationship with other stakeholders and balancing the needs of those different relationships. On to the next slide, please. So wherever you look, there are calls for changes in corporate governance, whether it's the Business Roundtable in the US, where companies have come together and basically said that, you know, capitalism is working, but it's fraying at the edges. We need an economy that serves all. Whether it's investors and the statements of BlackRock and and other major investors have been making about the importance of ESG, or it's the activity of regulators and governments where this is moving up the policy agenda, calling for change and really calling for boards to pay attention to the importance of ESG. On to the next slide, please. So why look at governance? Why this focus on boards when it comes to ESG? Well, it's necessary for a successful business. I can't really put it more plainly than that. If you want your business to succeed, and people have known this for a long time, and successful businesses have tended to this for a long time, you need to look after your people. You need to look after your communities. You need to look after the environment. You need to be part of the society in which you are present. So these are sort of fundamentals that are really being brought home to us in the context of the pandemic, where businesses had to understand where it fits into the landscape. Generally accepted that fiduciary duties are about the success of the company. It's not about increasing or maximising the wealth of the shareholder. That's been in company law forever, and it's being, I think, highlighted again that we've departed, and boards have departed somewhat from thinking more about the long-term success of the company. And so we do need to come back to that. And one of the reasons we need to come back to that is because businesses need a buffer. They need to build in resilience to be able to withstand those shocks that continue to be levelled at business. On to the next slide, please. So COVID, as I said, has really underscored all of these points. We don't really know what normal looks like anymore. And so we're having to adapt. The role of the state has overnight changed. You are no longer in control of whether your employees turn up for work. That's now really a function of government policy and the restrictions that are being put in place. On to the next slide, please. And I'm aware that we're running out of time. So we've developed a whole host of resources that are freely available on our website for directors to use to help them in building their knowledge when it comes to ESG, but also looking at how to integrate ESG into the way they exercise their fiduciary duties and in the way they manage their boards. So we have a self-assessment that is an online tool that allows you to assess where your board needs further development, particularly around ESG. And then we've organised our resources into these 5 pillars. On to the next slide, please. So that's the self-assessment tool. It's there to be used. You get a report at the end of it, which will tell you what areas you need to consider for development. On to the next slide, please. And then we have videos from leading experts. We have questions for the board, questions for management, and other resources that you'll find on our website. So these are all there for you to use. They've been tested with directors. They've been developed by experts in the field. And so hopefully they are valuable resources that you can make use of. On to the next slide, please. We also have a database as well. Again, I'll let you explore these resources at your leisure. On to the next slide, please, just to wrap up, and really to end on the point that the clock is ticking and that really you need to think about how quickly you can adapt your business model. So really, I just wanted to end with the fine words of a very fine Irish poet, W.B. Yeats. And really his message to us was then and still is now, we need to repair our relationships between business and the societies in which we serve, and to reconnect to the planet we live on, because we only have one planet. So thanks very much. Sorry to rush that at the end, but we're trying to keep to a fairly strict time schedule, Thomas. So thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you, Mario. That was brilliant, and I'd like to strongly emphasize the invitation to review some of those resources that the World Business Council and its members have been developing. I had an opportunity last year to view some of those in action. We even had Mario created a simulation of a board meeting discussing sustainability issues, and it was just fantastic. So thank you, Mario. I know that there's going to be questions, so I'll bring you back after the panel for some questions that people might have. Definitely that donut image was quite striking, and I'd like to talk to you more about that. So in the meantime, what I'll do is I would like to invite our panelists to unmute themselves and to turn on their cameras, and we can get started with the next part of the conversation. So while our speakers join us, I'd like to say a few words about them. Firstly, I'd like to introduce you to Beatriz Pessoa de Araújo is a partner at the Baker and McKenzie office in London. Bea has more than 30 years experience focusing on corporate governance, including board advisory, director duties, stakeholder governance, and subsidiary governance. Bea has not only been engaged in the World Business Council project on governance, but she has also advised the World Economic Forum on these issues. And I know the legal word is a competitive one, so great to add that Bea won Best in Corporate Governance in 2018 at the Euromoney Women in Business Law Awards Legal 500. So thank you for joining us, Bea, this morning. And secondly, I'd like to introduce to you John Reynolds. John is the non-executive chairman of Cairn PLC. John is a former CEO of KBC Bank Ireland, former president of the Irish Banking Federation, and during that period, a member of the board of the European Banking Federation. John is not only the chair of Cairn, but he's what we would call a serial director. He is also a director at the Institute of Directors in Ireland and Business in the Community. So you're both very welcome. And I might start breaking the ice into this conversation, just to start with COVID, because obviously that's where this all begins. Bea, I might start with you, and obviously you have been working on some of these issues for quite some time. I think Mario was very clear into some of those revolutions that are happening in terms of governance and how sustainability is getting deeper and deeper. If you had to summarize in a few words the last few months, do you think that COVID has derailed the conversation, has put it on a stronger sort of light, or has it taken it somewhere else?
Thanks, Thomas, and really glad to be here with all of you. Not at all. I don't think it's been derailed. The pressure to integrate ESG issues, I think, feels greater than before even. Before the pandemic, I think there's a sense that climate was moving from words to action. But earlier this year at Davos, there was a clear feeling by everyone that was there that sustainability topics were also moving from words to action. You mentioned the revolution, the so-called stakeholder capitalism versus shareholder primacy one. It's one I've been following dearly. The work I did do with the World Economic Forum culminated in a white paper that I wrote in collaboration with them, published last March last year. Sorry, get that right. Where one of the conclusions was that I could clearly see governance being on a journey where we were entering finally the era of stakeholder capitalism. Stakeholder theories have been around for a long time. A professor at business school in the US, Ed Freeman, has been teaching it since the 80s. But it's sort of a statement that to generate profits, you need to look after your stakeholders. And the pandemic has really put that even more into the fore. I think considering ESG matters in decision making is a board fiduciary duty, as Mario hinted to. It's seen that when you do ESG well, or your stakeholder governance is sound, that it's a risk mitigation strategy, so you're at peril if you don't do it. And we're now seeing even more pronouncedly than we had in the past that access to capital and valuations depend on how strong your ESG credentials are. If you want to see charts, there are a lot of charts that are very misleading around. The ones I find the most compelling are a not-for-profit called Just Capital, and they sort of score companies, mainly US companies, but I think it's helpful nonetheless. They score them into 5 categories of, you know, excellent ESG down to not very good, and then they sort of have looked at how they've performed during COVID, and there's a clear difference in performance. Also, we're seeing that governments are putting tons of money into the economy to protect jobs, etc. There'll be recovery funds needed. The EU's already put forward its own. And all of those funds, I'd be amazed if any of them don't have ESG strings attached to them. And lastly, I think society has become more vocal rather than less about what their expectations of companies are. So how you're dealing with employees at the moment, for example, is a big topic. People have to be let go, maybe, but it's a question of how you do it, when you do it, on what basis you do it. That really matters now. Yeah. So quite a bit happening and change moving very fast.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think what will be interesting, and we'll explore it in a few minutes, Bea, is how all of this enters the boardroom and what happens inside the boardroom when these donuts are put on the table, basically. So I think that's really interesting. But it's good to hear that it hasn't derailed, and I definitely would echo. I think Just Capital are doing some really good research on that space. John, if I can come over to you and maybe ask you to give us a sense of the board that you lead at Cairn. How has again COVID derailed or refocused or strengthened some of those conversations that you were developing around the whole ESG and sustainability agenda, and what's your sense of where are we going on this within the Cairn board?
I mean, reference has been made by both Bea and Mario to change. So I think the ability of businesses to respond to change at any time is a core competence. And change can obviously be positive or negative, and it can be purely corporate. It can be, as it is at the moment, you know, a period of societal vulnerability of an extreme proportion. So the engagement of a board and my Cairn board with change of itself is something that's a constant. For those of you maybe not entirely familiar with Cairn, we're approximately 5 years old. We were set up with an ambition to be a leading a home builder in Ireland, and you know, as of 2019-20, we're by sort of the metrics of production, we would be that. I say that not by way of corporate bravado, but more when we started the company, I would have reminded my colleagues on the board that there's a certain presumption as well as ambition in establishing a company that's going to be impactful. And that presumption brings with it a responsibility to behave in a particular way. You know, we're going to be impactful in our environment, we're going to be impactful in our communities. And that's been a guiding principle to how we've driven the company forward. You know, like as with every corporate entity, you know, the degree of enlightened self-interest, but also, you know, a sense of what it would take to be a good company in our chosen activity. To, you know, to specifically respond to your COVID question, you know, there's always a question of the topics that fall within the board bandwidth at any point in time, and I think it's a responsibility of the board chairperson, the CEO, and other directors to ensure that bandwidth always includes time for those dimensions which are seen as core or critical. So in our case, we have not allowed, nor wouldn't countenance you know, our journey in terms of our environmental responsibilities, our societal responsibilities, to sort of fall off the board landscape. That hasn't happened.
Okay, and John, if I could stay with you, then how would you sort of summarize the ESG journey to date at Cairn? What have you seen as the most relevant sort of milestones in that journey? And I think it's particularly interesting because it's a very young company, as you're saying. So it's probably a different starting point than other PLCs.
Sure, I suppose with that youth and with that kind of startup aspect comes with an opportunity. You would hope to do things, you know, learning from perhaps our sector's failings in the past, and also learning just from what's happening in our environment and how it's changed. So for us, I mean, clearly where we're very impactful is on the environment and place. So you know, we from the get-go, we've looked at making sure that as we build new sort of environments for communities, which is what we do, that we take into account, and we try to be as forward thinking as we can be in terms of what will be the sort of what will be the demands of our customers in the first place, what will be the demands of the communities within which we're building these homes. The people dimension, clearly, again, from the get-go, these are constants, but I'd say, you know, again, to bring it up to date in terms of COVID sensibility, I mean, what we're finding, obviously, in the course of the last 6 strange months is that our sensibility around people has become more heightened for obvious reasons. Also, in a positive way, our sensibility around our impact on place has become even more heightened, so that we're having to think even more sort of in a forward-looking way about the changing needs of the people who are living in the homes that we're building, and obviously everybody will have a sense of what those changes are. We talk, you know, it's constantly being talked about, and I would say from our perspective, we've got to, like every business, navigate between the topical kind of opinions and the core realities of what might emerge over time. In relation to the people side, I think it's been a period of extreme challenge, but also a really good learning period for us, because, you know, I think as Bea mentioned about the relationship between a company and its employees, you know, we've had to be very real about our duty of care in terms of, you know, obviously as a construction company, we were allowed by government to commence activity again, so we had to be very mindful of the context within which our staff were being asked to work on building sites. We had to be very mindful of the impact that work would have on the communities within which the building sites exist. So all of that, by its very nature, you know, improves your competence, I think, as a board. You're thinking even more proactively than you might have done in calmer times.
No, I agree, and it's interesting to see where that evolution is going. Bea, can we go back to maybe some of the key issues that Mario mentioned in terms of the journey that boards are navigating on this ESG, and we'll let COVID rest for a few minutes, and we can come back to it later. But you were talking about some of these big issues, and then I said, okay, then they get inside the boardroom. So what are you seeing as from the companies that you're advising and supporting as kind of the main challenges on this whole ESG sustainability integration, what is it that they're struggling most in terms of that process, and just reflecting on some of the pillars of the foundations that Mario was talking about?
Sure. And it is a challenge in some ways, although I love being a simple person, and it's not that difficult to go, adopt once you see the road. I mean, why does sustainability matter for directors? I think there are a number of reasons. Obviously, we've mentioned the overarching one is that directors owe fiduciary and other duties to act in a company's best interests. And by implication, it's long-term sustainable success. But there are other considerations. I mean, the negative one is there's increasing regulation that requires companies and directors to take sustainability issues into account in their business operations, but also in their decision making. And at least in the UK, we're seeing a push towards that. I think Mario hinted at this as well. There's a risk of litigations if not only if directors fall short in the duties they owe to the companies they oversee, but also if the company itself is in breach of regulation or incorrectly reports what it is or isn't doing. There's a risk damage to reputation, again, if a company falls short of what the public expects. So there's the court of public opinion, I call them the clicktivist, is something sometimes stronger than the societal risk is maybe bigger than legal risk in some circumstances. But these can be active both internally and externally. So we talked about externally clicktivists, but internally employees, your customers, your suppliers, the communities, etc., are putting, sorry, those are externals, are putting pressure on you to do certain things. And then internally, the employees themselves. And also a trend we're seeing now, reporting isn't very well established yet on a global basis, but increasingly we're seeing companies publicly committing to sustainability via best practice statements. I think Mario mentioned the Business Roundtable statement in the US, which is seen a bit cynically and positively. I think the jury's still out there, but this is coming at boards from many directions. And the last one I think I mentioned before is the investor community. They've become much more vocal. You've seen BlackRock now for a number of years in January writing a letter to CEOs, which they're listening to this year. He said that they wouldn't invest in companies unless they reported in accordance with the TCFD for climate. You've seen Goldman say they won't advise public companies who don't put at least, I think it's a woman or two on the board when they list. So the voice, all the voices around this are becoming stronger, and I think many boards are already doing all of this. They're already considering, have a clear purpose, have a clear understanding who their stakeholders are engaging with them, are bringing that voice back into the boardroom to inform the decisions, thinking about the company's long-term survival. So many companies are doing it, but I think, so to ignore all these pressures, if you aren't for any reason, I think does create trouble for you, I'm afraid.
And if you had to kind of nail it to the challenges, would you say that the challenge is more related to understanding the issue, to having the skill set required to assess those issues? So, you know, I was just discussing with John yesterday, you know, Siemens board invited Greta Thunberg to sit on their board. Is it about the skills and the knowledge? Is it about the decision making, or is it that we're still having that, which I see it on the Q&A already, that short-term versus long-term dilemma that it's still pushing for short-term decision making? What would you say is the biggest hurdle at the moment?
I think there are a number of things you need to do, but just briefly on the short term versus long term. The short term is the, you know, companies here to deliver profits to shareholders, full stop. Long term is a bit more bringing in stakeholder decision making. It's not one or the other. Shareholders are stakeholders. It's about reaching a position where if you engage your stakeholders well, you're going to survive in the long term, which is good for shareholders. And we're now seeing shareholder language changing. If you read the press, they're talking more about, we want long-term sustainable value creation rather than returns. That's one thing I've noticed during COVID.
Yeah.
But in terms of things boards can be doing, I think having a clear purpose is important. Just know what you're here to do, in the sense, and Mario gave my favorite definition of as well of it from the British Academy. I think boards need to have the expertise on board, so the diversity of skills is critical. Diversity, full understanding of all the stakeholders, and each company will know who their key stakeholders are, who they need to succeed in business. I think boards also need to ask pertinent questions of management. The information flow from management needs to be good. Absolutely. So that boards fully understand where the company is. So that expertise is needed to be asking the right questions. And then, as you mentioned in my in the intro, I'm also very interested not just in decision making at board level, but all the way down the company, down to the person who receives you in reception, or who's banging and making your products. The culture, the purpose, everything needs to stray down, and decision making needs to be good at all those levels. It can't just be somewhere along the line. And then obviously all of this is risk and opportunity. So that's clearly a board oversight of it. So they need to fully understand where the opportunities are for us. It's not just a negative story. Yeah. But there are a lot of things that need to be sort of thrown into that soup.
Absolutely. And I can see there's some really good questions. So I'll ask you, John, another question, and then I'd like to start addressing some of the questions which are also very, very interesting. But just to maybe staying in the ESG journey of Karen, are you seeing some echo in terms of some of these big challenges when, for instance, Karen is talking to investors? Is that because sometimes we do hear a lot about, you know, the famous BlackRock letter and Goldman, and then sometimes we think we're a bit too far away from that. But is that something you're seeing yourself as well outside the boardroom and in the investor piece?
Very much so. It's part, I would say, in the investor conversations I've had over the past year. It crops up in each one. I mean, what I would say as well is it's a kind of a hardcore thing. You know, I think sometimes, you know, even questions like short term versus long term, in the corporate world, these dynamics and trade-offs are part of being a good business. And, you know, I mean, I think sometimes, not a lot, but you hear sometimes making the mistake that when they, as you say, the Larry Fink letter, when they read that, they think that it's a statement to replace, if you like, old school corporate profitability aspirations with some new kind of thing. It's not. It's much tougher than that. And I think, you know, business, you need to kind of get it very quickly that they want all the old stuff, and they want if call it the more aspirational societal engagement by companies. So I think that's just where it's at. So, you know, this angst over any trade-offs, you kind of have to get over it and you know, just deal with it. I think then what you have to do also is you have to be real. And I suppose in Karen, we've been on a journey over a number of years, and a lot of what we started doing initially was corporate intuition. You're trying to do things in the various areas in a beneficial way, be it, you know, looking at the sustainability of your supply chain, looking at biodiversity in those areas where you can influence all of that. Yeah. I think in very recent times, we've been engaging with business and the community to help us, you know, bring some sort of corporate objectivity around what we're doing. And I think that's terribly important. So, you know, we, like many other companies, think we're great, but, you know, how can we prove it? So I think that's something that it feeds into this expectation of investors, because what the investors will say, you know, they'll look at all the traditional corporate metrics, return, profitability, etc., and then they'll be quite sensibly, because they're sharp. They'll be looking for, you know, they'll read every single annual report now has pieties about you know, different things, but where's the proof and what's the evidence? So again, we have to be mindful of that. I must say, I think, and I've always felt in the context of our company that you know, it's just part of the if you like, the broad corporate competence of a good business. I think there's a phrase I've seen in some of the literature which talks about an agile business culture, and I think that concept of agility, which is really about responsiveness, and responsiveness to all the issues, financial, you know, societal, environmental, the judgment of a board is very much influenced by, or sorry, the judgment of a board in terms of its competence and quality should be around its agility and its responsiveness.
Yeah, no, and thanks for your honesty and for somehow demystifying that world of investors and expectations, because I think it's really interesting. I might ask Mario to rejoin us, because I see quite a good few questions that are very interesting. So let's see what we can make out of the next 5-7 minutes in terms of some of the questions. But the first one, which I'll throw out there, maybe Bea or Mario, you might want to take it. I mean, it's about the donuts. So, you know, the question is from Tom here: within the 3 components of ESG, it seems that the social societal aspect has taken increased prominence with COVID-19. And I was going to ask about Black Lives Matter as well. And Mario, you made that striking point about the outcomes of the elections in the US. So the question is there a risk that some of the environmental related considerations will be pushed to the sidelines? And ultimately, how are boards prioritizing within that very wide sustainability agenda? Because there's another question talking about, you know, it seems that it all comes at the same time, and it's human rights and it's biodiversity as much as it's water and as much as it's disclosure, inclusion, etc. So is there a risk from the environmental perspective?
I think there may be a risk. I think COVID has, and the response to COVID has kind of fundamentally changed our lives in the present moment. But I don't see the environmental concerns diminishing, really. I think John's absolutely right. I mean, if you want to be a director in this kind of grown-up world that we live in, you have to get over it. And you have to, yes, you have to deal with human rights. You have to deal with climate change. You have to deal with all these things. And it's probably no secret that successful businesses have had to do this, you know, throughout history. I mean, you know, we always try and think that our situation's so unique. But, you know, you can look back over periods of history and see that, you know, businesses have had to face all sorts of challenges. And these are just the sets of challenges that, you know, we're being presented with. But I don't think the environmental is diminishing. And if anything, it's creating some real crunch points. So, for example, by the end of this decade, it's something like 50% of India will be have a complete water shortage. So it'll be water stressed. And, you know, potentially, you think that through, that's going to lead to all sorts of social problems, because you're going to have populations moving. You're going to have assets that basically have to get written off because they can't operate anymore. I mean, these are kind of cliff edges that we're facing. So that's just sort of new realities, I think.
Absolutely. Bea, could I ask you, because you mentioned and you gave already your view on the Business Roundtable, and the question here is initiatives like the Business Roundtable, this whole move for inclusive capitalism. Do you really think it's going to make a difference? Is it going to move the dial in terms of companies revising, reconsidering their purpose?
I think enlightened companies are, or good companies that do business well, as putting it in John's words, which I think is exactly right, are already doing a lot of these things. And those that aren't are probably having a look to see how can we do this better, what's missing, just to sort of step back and look. I think the FT sort of went and talked to a big chunk of the 100+ CEOs that signed the Business Roundtable statement last year. And if you're interested in the Business Roundtable statements, I would urge you to read through the ones they've written over the past 20 years. It's a fascinating history of stakeholder capitalism, shareholder primacy back to stakeholder capitalism. We're here for society. It's a big, I mean, I was surprised. I don't know why. I must have had too much time one day just reading through them. It was quite enlightening. But anyway, they have talked to most of the businesses that signed it, and their sense was that a third said, oh, we're already doing a lot of this stuff. A third said, we're looking to see what we can change. And a third clearly didn't understand what they'd signed. I'm sort of paraphrasing a bit, but I think it's every company needs to dig deep. I don't think any company is going to save the world in inverted brackets, but I think every company needs to look to see what its impact on the world is, on the planet, on people, on societies, on its community, and think carefully whether that's the legacy it wants to leave, whether, you know, if this today may not matter, tomorrow it may matter. So let me start thinking about how I can address it now so that when it is going to hit me. So that's a sort of slightly longer term view approach. And I think John is much closer to investors than I am. The community I'm supporting with the World Economic Forum is actually the investor community. And I think there we're seeing a few watershed moments where COVID is really having an impact. For example, in the UK, banks being told they can no longer pay dividends so that they keep their capital in good shape to keep pumping money into the economy, I think is very telling. There hasn't been an all-right revolt of investors. A number of investors have said they want their companies to reinvest in the business, not to cut capex, not to cut people, and willing to take dividend sacrifice. That companies that are doing that well are also looking at their own remuneration structures, such as there's a whole sort of chain and reaction thing going on. But I think you need to, you know, sit back carefully as a board and say, you know, what is our role here? What are we trying to achieve, and how are we achieving it? What do our employees expect of us? Because you can't be tone deaf to those who work for you and those who you might want to employ in the future, plus your customers, obviously.
Absolutely. I'm looking at the clock. So Mario, I'll ask you a yes/no question. Will we see global standardized ESG reporting? Is that $1 million question, obviously, but any thoughts?
I think the answer is yes. Can I add one sentence?
Yes.
To say that it's not just about standardization, it's about being able to evidence that you do what you say you do. And at the moment, that's a real exposure for a lot of companies.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Okay, I have to apologize because there are a few more questions out there that I haven't been able to bring forward, but I'm conscious of time and I don't want everybody to drop off before the end. So I'm going to bring the panel to a close to give a big thank you to John, to Bea, to Mario for this, and to say that definitely there's way more to talk about this, and I sincerely hope that this is probably the beginning of many joint activities with IOD, because we haven't spoken about skill set development, director training, and so forth and so on, which are areas that are very, very relevant. So let me bring the session to a quick close by first saying thank you to the audience for taking part, for the questions, the speakers, of course, Maura and the whole team at IOD. And I'm just going to leave you with a date in the diary. And this is some sort of a sneaky preview to let you know that Business in the Community is organizing this webinar series that we've called Beyond the Rhetoric, because we all want to go into the real practical and what's really making the difference on the environmental, the social, and the governance. So there'll be more conversation about this director issue and sustainability. But as you can see, I'm sure your eyes are on the other side of the slide. We are going to kick off the session on the 14th of October with an in-conversation with Paul Polman, who's a very well-known and regarded sustainability leader. I'm sure it's going to be fantastic. Please keep this to yourselves. We're going to make a public announcement on Monday, but we wanted you to know. I'm going to stop here, and again, thank you very much, everybody, for the participation. This was only just the beginning, and we'll be sharing some resources that we hope will be useful for everybody. Thank you very much, and have a good afternoon.